How's it going, YouTube? Coming at you today with another video. And today, guys, what to bring to you is another episode of the GGYGO podcast. Today, I am joined by Kody Manabe. Introduce yourself to the channel.
Hi guys, my name is Kody Manabe. I have a YouTube channel. It's Kody_YGO. I travel a lot for tournaments, a lot of case tournaments and console tourneys. Some of you may know me as the person who created the 3-Axis deck. That's something, so yeah.
Yeah, Sangan is definitely a cool card. It's,
Sangan's crazy.
it definitely goes hard. So I like that card a lot. I think it's really cool, all the different decks that have been using it lately, especially. And then you definitely let me know that Sangan was good back at the PPG as well. So that card went insane. So, I definitely have seen you around in the game. And I'm glad that you're joining us today in the video, because today we're talking about some very important topics as far as improving at the game in an all-around competitive Yu-Gi-Oh background. We're talking more about how to improve at becoming competitive and what it means to be competitive. If you haven't checked out my sponsors over on Imperial Duelist and Dragon Shield, it's down in the description below. But without further ado, let's hop right on into the content today. And the first question that we're going to ask is actually just going to be, which one is better? Do we like Sprite more or do we like Tier more? Which one do you think?
Personally, I'm a big fan of this deck, the Sprite deck. So there are a lot of reasons that contribute to my decision of why I believe this deck is better. The main one is that it's less like RNG based, which I really like in a deck. I'd rather have a more consistent all-around engine that's also really powerful. It just does the most with 2 cards. So yeah, it can make like 7 to 8 negates depending on the hand.
Yeah, I definitely like the deck a lot. I think that it's really good. I know that a lot of people right now are playing Tier, and there's a lot of talk about how Tier, once it becomes more figured out, that it's going to eventually just be the better deck, or later on when we have the Ishizu cards. I think that the deck does have a lot of promise, but Sprite being so linear, and it's very cookie cutter, right? Like, the deck can also be splashed into a lot, but at the same point, like, the deck just does what it does, and it does it very well. The fact that you can have things like Ronin Totem in your graveyard, and that's just enough to come back into a duel, because if you have any 2 in your hand, you can go off. And even not just a 2. Like, if you have Ronin plus a normal summon, you can at least get an elf and then go into another full combo. Which is pretty crazy, considering that you just have the line to go, like, the blue jet starter, or you go jet starter blue monster. And it's pretty nice that one card can generate so much advantage, because we talk about a lot of times where you have cards in a deck that you literally have to hand trap before you're allowed to just go completely off. And I feel like blue and jet just enable the deck to have that choke point that you have to shut off before it just is able to get too much advantage.
Yeah, totally. Like, the thing about blue and jet is that those are cards that gain advantage for you. But if you do hand trap it, then you just make a gigantic Sprite, and that's also devastating because that gigantic turns into double toad. So there's no really like good choke points in the deck, especially if you start off with like different supplementary engines. Like, you can make all Mirage, you can have red. Red's crazy, honestly. Red and Carrot, Spell and Trap, and the Monster Negate. Honestly, those provide so much utility in Toolbox for the deck. It's just why I believe that it's so good in a format that's not solved yet.
Yeah, I would have to agree, because this is a deck that really just came out of the gate, and it was just letting people know that it was one of the best decks of the format, because we saw at almost every regional on the weekend that it came out that it won. There was one that, shout out to Trishula, he won with Dragon Link, but on the other regionals, it was just the Sprite show. So I think that's really interesting to see, and I really am interested to see what happens today in the regionals, because we have another one, and I really want to know what the results are going to be. And I think it's going to be very heavy in Sprite's favor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Tearlament is also a really good deck, but the thing about Tearlament is it's not really great against like some of the older decks like Dragon Links, because Tearlament's can't afford to run that many hand traps. They mainly run board breakers, but Sprite, like, it overall, I can like run board breakers, hand traps. I used to be a firm believer that Tearlament was better, like prior to Poke coming out. I was on the Tier train, and I said Sprite sucked. But after a few days of testing, I was playing like an Adventure Punk variant of Sprite. That was good. And then I started transitioning to Pier, and I realized that it was so consistent, and it just did what it needed to do.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see how so many people are using Prosperity or Desires, and people are really starting to figure out like which build is going to eventually be the best one. And this is still the first wave of support. We already know we're getting another Link 2. There's potentially down the road we could see some support for this too, because a lot of times when we get really broken cards right off the bat, it does not mean that we're not getting even more soon. So I'm definitely interested to see what more the deck can get. It's pretty interesting to think about because we look at like Tier Element and we know that they're getting another really strong fusion, but it's just like, what else is Sprite gonna get?
Yeah, no, absolutely. With support coming down the line, it looks as if Tier Element will be the better deck in the future, just based off of the cards. But I do think that Sprite is really good against the Tier Element deck. But yeah, it all depends on the ban list, of course, if Hulk stays or goes, and what support cards we get. TCG exclusive really matter in this game.
Now, there's one thing that I will give Tier that I think is definitely talked about a lot right now, is that you can't really Nibiru Tier. You can't blow up their board. There's a lot of things that you just can't do to that deck. And so that's why cards are coming in to go ahead and mitigate that, like the cards that say Tribute, because it's something where anything else will just go ahead and trigger the board. And that's one thing that I do like about the deck, and that it has that ability to play through things like DRNM because of the trap cards. And the deck does have a lot of promise, and I'm not by any means saying that's going to be a bad deck. I think it's the second best deck of the format right now. I think it's really strong, but at the same point, I just think that Sprite's going to be the better one, at least for right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. Tier Element can just do so much when it goes off, but Sprite overall has the better like control deck. But I do think that Tier Limit is so underrated right now, because of like of the unexplored things. Because I've seen Branded, Eldritch, I've seen the Danger Engine. Like people are playing Mass Change too. There's a lot of like unexplored variants of the deck that you can run, and it's still like is good. I also think the Punk Engine is crazy in that deck, having the capability of milling like 10 cards per turn.
Yeah, absolutely. There was like really early combos where we saw people summoning like Falco off of the Hulk too to get to the instant window play. It was just super cool. I don't really know how great it really was, but because you have to play like more bricks, right? But it was definitely cool. So there's still a lot more room for that deck to develop, and I'm really interested to see what it does.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that you bring up the Falco, because when I said I played Tier before, that was actually one of the first versions I built was with the Punks, and then it had Falco in it, and it didn't seem as good as the Pure version or like with the Dangers, because the Dangers are good by itself. They trigger the Tier elements and they draw a card plus their body for Curious. I just think that engine in the future might end up being the superior engine, that or the Eldritch version, because filling Eldritch cards are really good, and it has the stun capability. Same thing as like the Branded Eldritch deck did.
Yeah, the Eldritch variant that I saw was really cool. And then definitely looking at more potential variants down the line, just having things like Nessie that's also an Aqua, very convenient.
This past weekend, I actually played against a Tier Element player who was playing like this one level 4 Sea Serpent card that said if this card is discarded, it can special summon itself. And I thought that was kind of neat because it gave you easier access into Toad. And then he also ran cards like Kaijus. I didn't personally like the Kaijus in the deck, but I did like the level 4 guy. I don't remember its name, but he was able to like make Toad easier. And that's another thing about the Tier Element deck, the rank 4 access.
Yeah, absolutely. And cards like Redoer are just really cool. Even playing like Dweller just shuts down so much. But that's another reason why I like Splite right now, though, because you can make things like Arclight very easily. And Arclight versus Tier is a bad time. So it's pretty strong.
Yeah, Arclight's crazy.
Yeah. But we're talking a lot about what is the best deck between the two. But what makes the best deck? So looking at certain engines, like being able to utilize the Brave engine still, being able to utilize cards like Calamity, and then we have even cards like Mystic Mine. And so in my opinion, it's always been the deck that can abuse the best cards the best. But what do you think really does make the best deck in a format?
So obviously there's a fine line between power and consistency. The trade-off between running the Brave engine is that you have to run the 3 quote-unquote bricks. Same thing as like other engines in the past. You had to, like the Brilliant Fusion engine, you had to run the Garnet. But then you also have that explosiveness that it offers. Like it's some of like the best cards in the game So what I do think is the best deck is the deck can abuse some of those cards without trading too much of their consistency. So they have a consistent like main engine, but they're also able to play those supplementary engines so they don't brick as hard as other decks with that engine would normally do.
So when you start playing even like the Sangan deck, right? And you have a ton of hand traps and you have this engine that can go off pretty easily. What do you think goes into the thought process of building something like that?
The main reason why I built that deck was because at the start of the format, everybody was on Dark Ruler and not really hand traps. So I decided to play a deck that could do the best thing at that time, which was like DPE Scythe. But it also sets up a Herald with it, so you wouldn't be able to get Dark Rulered or Dropleted.
Dropleted,
that's the thing. Like, yeah, you have to like be able to like look at the meta and create a deck that suits the meta. And like the meta is continuously changing. Every day the meta changes, I believe. People will always find new tech cards. They will always come out with new deck ideas that they want to try. And that's when a deck can somehow become the best deck. Like at first it was based, but then Prank Kids became the better deck, of course, because there was the consistency. So in the long run, I do think that the deck that's more consistent but explosive will be the better deck.
So do you think that there is a lot of decks or even a lot of cards right now that we'd want to see on the ban list because they're particularly crutches to decks, specifically looking at cards like Mystic Mine?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that Mystic Mine should go. I hate Flunderies. I just cannot beat that at a YCS or any like high level event. So I do think the barrier statue is another problem because the deck just has an auto win with so many cards. The deck has like Harpy's Featherstorm, it can Shifter, like the barrier statue, and I just think it's like unfair at that point. But then Mystic Mine is also another problem because it's a card that says basically to your opponent, if you play a card, you have to be able to run like different cards to out it, or else you're going to get cooked by it.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see because there's a lot of people even asking me now, like, hey, if Mystic Mine got banned, does that mean that Striker is going to be a terrible deck? And it's like, even right now, Striker is just rogue. But at the same point, you got to realize that, like, if there's a focal point around a certain card in the game that a lot of people are using as, like, a crutch, or they're using it because it's a really good card, it doesn't mean that the deck that is using it the best is going to just outright not be a deck, because they'll still adapt to whatever the format is and like whatever cards they can use. But I feel like it's more so one of those things where it's like, if there is a really broken card in the format or in the game and you can use it, there's no reason to not use it. It's the same reason Flunderies runs Shifter. It is just, if you can play those cards, you play those cards.
Yeah, it's great that you brought up Striker, actually, because I think that's the most adaptable deck of every single format since its release. That's the only deck that can kind of like switch up its engine to like cater for the meta. At the start, at the early ages of Striker, a lot of decks didn't even run Mystic Mine, and even like in Ryan Yu's list, he didn't really when he won the LCS, I was Synchro Eldritch format. He didn't play Mystic Mine. He just played a pure like control Striker deck.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because Striker is one of those decks, like you said, it's very adaptable. I've played it for a long time, and it's something that I really enjoy because just looking at all of these different ideas in general, you can kind of see as the game progresses, if you can find a way to find the better cards in the game and really be able to work them into your strategy, it's gonna go a long way.
No, yeah, absolutely.
So the next question that I have for you is actually really important, and I feel like this comes up a lot. And this is going to be talking about the topic of improving versus winning. Do you feel like there's a really big idea in the game right now that you have to win to be improving versus just trying your best at a tournament and slowly getting better every time?
So I actually think that you don't really need to win to learn. I think that most of your experiences that you learn from is by losing. Because look at old scientists. There was always a saying that he didn't fail like 100 times. He just learned 100 times how to do it differently, how to like get it correctly. So that's kind of like what Yu-Gi-Oh is. It's all about learning from your losses. That's something that Pac, shout out to him. That's what he's been like kind of like preaching on his channel. So I think that after a game, it's really nice to kind of like go over what you did. Even after wins, sometimes it's nice to like think about, oh, how did I win this? Was there any point in the game where I could have like won earlier or like played around a certain card? So winning doesn't always define you improving, because winning also does take some luck. But improving as a player, like you have to learn from that. That takes like self-talk. So in order to improve, you have to look at what you did and try to think about if there's another way that's better.
Yeah, I would definitely have to agree. I feel like this idea that you have to have like X amount of wins or that you have to top is really just kind of getting out of hand. And I feel like it's something where a lot of people are feeling more defeated when they go to these big tournaments and they don't do well. But then what I see is if they went even X2 and they're used to going like X3 drop at a regional and now they're going X2 consistently, it's something to me that speaks volumes because you're doing better. Now you just have to hone it a little better, and then maybe you can start going X1 at those regionals versus X2 because at least you're that close every single time. Eventually, that's going to tip over, and you're going to start doing a lot better.
No, yeah, absolutely. Traveling to these events and like playing in like more competitive tournaments, like you learn a lot. Like, because not only are you like thinking like you don't want to lose, but you also are more like confident when you play, or you're more in the zone when you play. So in overall, you're going to be playing better because of the fear of losing.
Yeah, there's definitely a big confidence thing, and it's really cool whenever I find, even right now, because Master Duel really did a lot for the game, because we're seeing a ton of players that are just like, yeah, this is my first time going to regional, or this is my first time going to a local, and it's really cool, and it's something that the more you go to is the more confident you're going to feel when you're sitting down. Even as someone who has played the game as long as I have, when I go to a YCS and it's round one, you still get some jitters, you know, like you still sit down, you're still like, all right, here we go. Like it's round one, you know, like it's exciting. It's something that I feel like everyone should enjoy. And it's really something that I find amazing about the game and something that I don't think will ever go away.
No, yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I remember my first ever nationals, and I was probably like 16 at the time. This was 2018. I was like terrified of like playing. And then I think it was like round 7 or 8. I played against Kody Manabe. And I was like, at this point, we were both X1. I was like terrified of that like matchup. I was like, oh my God, am I going to lose? Am I going to win? Are we going to draw? Like, I didn't want to like see a good player's name. But with time, you're going to kind of like get over that fear. And I think the best way to like really improve is to not see someone as better than you, but to see you as like player to player, you know? Because once you see that, like you're saying that, oh, I'm playing someone better than me, then you're kind of already defeating your own self.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That was something too, like I hear a lot. And whenever you're sitting down against somebody, you kind of just have to realize that you put the time and effort into your strategy and you know exactly what your cards do. And especially if you've already practiced in the format enough, you should have the confidence to sit down and play against that person no matter who they are. So it's definitely a big thing to really get out of your head at a certain point to really just play the game and feel confident in your plays.
No, yeah, absolutely. Another thing that like kind of like really helped me get over fear and like how like which helped me improve was watching old YouTube videos of like past players like that were quote unquote like better players. So by learning like them and hearing their explanations, not only from their deck profiles, but also watching their gameplay and then a lot from their theory too. Like you learn a lot of theory from them, and then it kind of like inspires you because then you can kind of like take that into your own like gameplay. And then you kind of learn from the pros by watching old videos. Something funny I've noticed, because I've been rewatching like old Patrick Hoban videos, and instead of a deck profile, he really focuses on a lot of his theory.
Yeah, and that's really cool too. And I can't even tell you the countless number of people that I've played against in the game or got advice from, and it really did go a long way. And it's something that even to this day, I apply all of that every single time that I go to a tournament. And it's really important because we're going to talk about something later on in the video too. And it really is something where you have to study the game if you want to be good. And it's something where if you see the format changing, you really want to start figuring out fast, like as soon as you can, like how the format is changing and how you can adapt to that format.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. The quicker you are at picking up like meta trends, the easier it is for you to like be better at the game. Here, you're able to see trends, and so you get to like play test longer, and that's a big thing. Play testing and like learning matchups is one of the probably the most important things.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And so we're talking about meta trends, and we're talking about looking toward the future and what sets are going to be coming out. I really want to have this discussion with you on whenever you see a brand new deck, how do you know if it's a flop versus if it's meta right away? Is it something that you think that you have to wait until the set's out, or do you think that sometimes it's just glaringly obvious which one's going to be the best deck?
Sometimes it's not like obvious. I never take OCG into account. A lot of people do, but OCG is such a different meta, so then I never like look at that. I like to read the cards for myself and try to think of cards we have, and that pretty much decides whether it's a flop or like a top. You know, like I said, tier limits. I thought that deck was broken, and it still is. Like when it resolves, when it completely goes off, the deck is crazy. So I thought that deck is an auto top if you're playing it. And I thought Sprite was actually the worst. Like it was worse than some of the decks currently. But the more like you play with it, like you really have to like play with the decks to understand if it's good or not. Because not only is a deck good, but if it suits your play style and the way you play the game, then maybe the deck is just broken, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because I bring up this question since I always hear so many different people talking about like a new deck that's on the way, right? And then everyone's like, oh, this deck's amazing, it's so good. And then it comes out and it's not that good. And it's something where the vice versa situation happens too, where you're just like, wow, this deck's so great. And it comes out and it's just insane. So it's a matter of what makes that deck just from the look of what it does as a really competitive deck in the meta. Do you think that it's just because it's something that really does counter what's currently going on, or is it just because the standalone effects are just really strong?
You have to look at what the decks do, like in comparison to every other deck. Again, like if a deck's more consistent, then of course it's like not going to be as powerful. But consistency in this game like really triumphs like heavily over power sometimes, because luck is also like one of the biggest factors. I do believe that consistency, I would rather go for consistency over power, but sometimes in a like unsolved format, power could be like the better deck, of course, but most of the time control is usually better in unsolved. And once the format becomes like more known, then that's when you see like the power decks come out. Like Dragon Link at the very end of it just became like this powerhouse when everyone thought Sword Soul was the best deck. I just never was a fan of that deck in that like literally last format.
Yeah, Nationals, like half the room was Dragon Link, so it was pretty cool.
Yeah, like you could see like that was like one of the meta trends that followed, and it's funny because that deck has been a deck like for a long time, but nobody picked up on it. Like everybody was just so hype on Despia and Sword Soul, but Dragon Link was just chilling in the background, and who knew it was going to be like this huge powerhouse out of the gate at Nationals.
Yeah, it's very strong. And again, shout out to Trishla. You know, Mike Thomas was crazy with that deck.
Big fan, Mike. Big fan.
Big fan. Yeah, oh, you know, he always reminds me that that deck is just the best. It's actually just wild. It's so good.
No, Mike loves Dragon Link. He does.
Yeah, I played it for Nationals too, so it was fun.
You played Dragon Link.
I did.
Oh, I'm surprised. I thought you would have been on Striker.
No, you know, I saw the adventure package in that deck, and I was like, "There's no way I don't play that." So it was pretty strong. It was cool.
That was the thing. Like power sometimes triumphs consistency. At that point, that deck was just too crazy.
Yeah, you know, the amount of utility that you got to play in the deck alongside the actual engine, it was just wild.
Yeah.
It was actually just so good. And so, like, we're talking about all these different decks. We're talking about looking at the future. and what decks are going to be good, what decks are going to be bad. And then we're also talking about meta trends. We're talking about how fast can you pick up on those. So when you're going into a format, say looking at how this format was, how do you go about choosing the correct hand traps?
Oh, so for me personally, choosing the right hand traps, you kind of have to look at what people are gonna like flock to. Like what is going to be the most represented decks. Of course, you're going to have the old format decks, which some of them lose to Nib, and then you're always going to have Ash, which should kind of like be in almost everyone's deck because that's the most universal. But then you have to look at what your deck is good against. If your deck is catered to a certain matchup, then you don't really need a hand trap for it because your deck is already built for that deck. So you can play other cards for like the tougher matchups. So when I deck build, I always build my decks for pretty much the top 3 decks, which right now, in my opinion, is Dragon Link, Tier, and Sprite. And mine is heavily geared towards the Sprite mirror. Of course, it's the most represented deck. So that's how I think going about hand traps should have this idea in your head, like which hand traps you're going to play and like what are you going to see in these amount of rounds.
Yeah, I would have to agree. When I'm looking at this format right now, I think that Bell is just a really cool option. I feel like Tier Element is just one of those decks that can get pretty rough to deal with. So I think that the 2 main hand traps that should be in everyone's deck right now is Crow and Ash. And if you are...
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you're worried about Tier, then you should be siding 3 Bell. I think that having Bell plus Crow, insane. Against that matchup, it just almost guarantees you that you're going to see at least one of them, and it's going to help you so much more in that matchup.
Little spice right now in my Sprite deck, I do side deck shifter and an XYZ card, so it's pretty much like an FTK versus Tier. So that was kind of like one of the things that I sided because I knew Tier like is so impactful when it goes off that I needed like an auto win versus it. So like sometimes if your deck can play shifter, you can play shifter, but Bell is also really good too because it stops the elf, it stops called by all the Tier cards. Stops the Ronin Totem.
Stops Crow.
Stops Crow. Yeah, that's a huge one. Especially if you're playing Tier Elements, I do think that instead of like main decking Crow, you should just be main decking the Bells because the only thing you're really like losing to is Ash and Crow. So why not play a card that counters one of the 2 cards you lose to?
While also being proactive in the format. Even if you're playing against MathMech, it shuts down the trap.
That's something I was about to talk about. In my deck profile, I was talking about like some cards that I would change. One of them was like, I was thinking about Bell if there's more MathMech, like if MathMech becomes more popular. But right now it's kind of like seeing little to no play. But the Fractorial card is so good, and Bell just kills that deck.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Revolt situation. And
no, absolutely it
pretty
is.
Good. And
yeah, it's like Tri-Brigade, but worse.
We are seeing some try lists that are, trying out the format and they're playing with the Sprite cards. So maybe we do see some kind of Revolt play. But in general, I think that Bell is just really cool right now. I think it's a very good option. Again, for all the reasons that were mentioned, and then also being able to shut down the Reborn on the Toad, which is really strong too. And you can actually like commit to your board after you play through like the 1 negation, which is nice.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's like one of the big things like that the Sprite deck has access to continuous starter every turn basically, and then also having access to Toad every turn, which is super nice.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people right now, they're trying to main deck Ogre or they're siding it, and it's something that's in my side. I don't main it, but I definitely think that's just another good option right now too. And I always try to go for like the most generically good cards as far as hand traps go. So like my main deck lineup right now is just Ash, Imperm, and Crow. I want to main deck like 2 Bell as well, but I just need to find space. But as far as that goes, I always try to look for as generic as possible. And especially in the format, if all of them do enough, because sometimes we have certain formats, even, I don't remember when this was, I think it was like a year ago, 2 years ago, no one played Ash in their main deck. It was always just siding, or it was maining like Meister and Bell, and that was the format. And sometimes even the best cards, you have to consider that maybe they're just not good, because if we look at the format right now, there's a lot of people not playing Droplet, and that's an objectively amazing card.
Droplet is insane, but the reason why I do think it's not being played is because of the fact that when you do Droplet, you're most likely going to have to Droplet a board of 3 or 4, and
Right.
you kind of lose so much advantage from that one. If you're playing a deck like Drytron, then of course you should Dark Ruler and Droplet should be in your deck. But if you're playing a deck like the Mirror Match, you can't afford to waste like 5 cards in your first, like just to negate the board.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And that's one thing that a lot of people, you know, they have things like Droplet and they're like, I want to play it. The card's really good. But it's just another thing about recognition and really realizing that sometimes the best cards just aren't the best cards at the time.
No, absolutely. It's actually funny that you mentioned you didn't play Ogre, because in my list, I run 3 Ash, 3 Ogre, 3 Veiler, 3 Crow, 3 Imperm, and 3 Nib. Like, that was what I chose to go with, because I do think Dark Ruler isn't as impactful against the Sprite deck. It's a lot better against Tier Limit, but not the Sprite deck.
Yeah, I definitely understand that too. And there's just a lot of things right now that I feel like a lot of people are just trying out. Because even against Sprite, like if you hit them with DRNM and then they have starter plus mashers, it's like
Yeah.
they're okay. Because considering the deck plays so many hand traps that you have to play through those and hand traps, you're probably not getting very far. So
That was kind of the reason why I played 18 hand traps in my main deck, was to, like, everybody's on Dark Ruler, so that's like one of the hand trap decisions that, or the meta trends that you can like follow with. I am playing such a heavy hand trap count that it kind of mitigates me getting Dark Ruler, but it's also really good when, you know, I'm going second. So going first, I have hand traps to back up my board. Going second, I just have all these hand traps.
yeah, it's definitely strong. And hand traps, it's definitely the biggest discussion every format. Is this a board breaker format or a hand trap format? And I feel like every single time that it's a board breaker format, it immediately becomes a hand trap format because everyone's is prepared for it, and it just becomes no longer good.
Yep. At the start of the format, a lot of people were talking about it. Even me and my circle of shout out to the studs, we were talking about, oh, this is like going to be a board breaker format. Dark Ruler, droplets, talents are all going to be insane. But the more people like caught on to that, that's when it realized that instead of playing the mirror match with just who has Dark Ruler, who has talents, you know, we should just play all these hand traps to kind of play around those cards.
That's another reason why I like Bell and Crow, is because especially against decks like Mathmech that do play talents, it's something where you don't have to stop anything that they do. All you have to do is stop Super Factorial. So Bell and Crow both allow you to hand trap on your turn safely away from talents. So it's something where you can play around these cards the second that you know that they're in the format.
That's why I said that Mathmech is probably a worse Tri-Brigade, because instead of like Appaloosa Revolt with Dragon Lords, they set up IP, the Code Talker, Heat Soul, and then the Fractorial. I mean, drawing 2 is really nice, but also a bounce plus 3 negates is, I think, better as an end board.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how the decks will develop over the rest of the format, especially because we do have a ban list hopefully soon. A lot of people have a lot of predictions as to what could get hit, and if the cards that people want to get hit right now do, it's going to be a wild format that we're walking into.
Absolutely. One thing I will note about the ban list is that if Haup does get banned, I do think that tier limits might become worse, because they can't really play the explosive build, which is the punk build. But also Sprite kind of has like it's not going to be as great, because adding a hand trap is like somewhat important. It's really nice if you're not scared of the Nibiru, of course. But another deck is Dragon Link. So I think the top 3 decks right now will get like affected. And that's when I think decks like Sword Soul and Flunder might rise, because those decks are really good at going second, but not playing Crystron.
Yeah, the Halco Fibrax, if that gets hit, that's going to be a crazy shakeup to the game, because there's just so many decks that just rely on that card. So we're going to have to see what they can do without it.
But I honestly don't think Hulk should get banned. I do like the card. I think that it's a fair card. I think that there's another card that should get banned instead of Hulk. Of course, the Scythe. I just think Scythe is main problem, because the Dragon board can be outed, of course, with hand traps or like Dark Ruler, which everybody's playing. So if you have the Scythe, then like sometimes you just can't play around that.
Yeah, that's another thing too. A lot of people are siding Sanctum Scythe right now because they just realized that you have
Oh
Talons in the
yeah.
main phase and Dark Ruler. Why not just standby phase, flip Sanctum, and then just play around everything?
So instead of they're playing the Appointer, which should have been in everyone's deck at the time, if your deck can afford to play the Sanctum package, then you can play like that, and that engine's crazy too. But again, like you have the brick for power, but it's all how the meta shifts. You know, if more decks become like less prevalent in the meta, like say tier limits become less prevalent, then I think cards like a pointer can come out of the side deck because I think that was like the main scariest thing to get Dark Rulered in. The Sprite Mirror is like whatever. If you just have Smashers, you banish their normal monster, and if they have Starter, then they have it. But tier limits, if they have Dark Ruler and they can go off, the deck is crazy.
Yeah, I definitely got 2 tiers revealed on me at the regional, and I was like, uh-oh. Like, I was like,
Yeah,
end phase Shizuku, and they're like, Hoffness, and I was like, oh god, and then they flipped too, and I was like, okay, this is fun. I had 3 fusions in the end
yeah.
phase looking at me, and I was like, well, this is rough.
Oh my god, yeah, no, that's crazy. That's the thing about tier limits. It just does so much that once it gets rolling, you can't beat it.
Yeah, so definitely interesting. But Kody, I wanted to say thank you for joining me today on this video. It's been a lot of fun talking a lot about what it means to be competitive in the game and what you can do to really improve your competitive level. There is so much to talk about in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I feel like these little excerpts and videos talking with different people and their own ideas, it's really important to hear, and it's something that is going to help people in the long run really start understanding how to play the game a bit better.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was great.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you haven't already checked out Kody's YouTube, definitely go over there, check it out. It will be in the link in the description below. So definitely feel free to look down there for it too. If you haven't already checked my Discord, Twitch, Twitter, and Instagram, definitely go over there, check it out. And if you want a coaching session over at Metafy, feel free to hit me up if you have any questions. I hope that everyone has a wonderful day, and we'll catch you all in the next video.